Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Gantz. I'm one of the small business coaches at the Small Business Development Center at Lorain County Community College. And I'm so excited about this topic today. This topic is something we're asked about almost on a daily basis. And so I'm going to be chatting today with David Vance. David is an employment attorney, and we're going to be talking about a W-2 versus an independent contractor. And so, David, thank you so much for joining me today. Please, if you want to share a little bit about what you do and about your law firm.
Sure. So thank you, Beth, for having me. I appreciate it very much. I know you and I have not worked together for very long, but I've been so impressed by what you do and what the SBDC is doing. And I agree, this is a fantastic topic. This is, riddled with problems and landmines for small employers and small businesses. And it's really something that they need to look at right from the beginning, so they don't get into trouble 6 months from when they started, or a year. I mean, this can literally bankrupt businesses. So it is just a really timely and excellent topic for folks. In terms of a little bit about me, so my name's David Vance. I am an attorney. I started my own firm about a year ago. It's Vance Law LLC. I worked for a place for about 15 years doing labor and employment law exclusively. That's what I do. Initially just representing employers. Part of the reason why I left was so I could do some work with employees too. But my niche and what I really like to do the most when working with employers is working with those small businesses that are growing, that maybe started with 1 or 2 people and have grown to 5, 10, 15, 20, 50, and help them kind of grow and make sure that their ducks are kind of in a row, and that they're protected from a legal perspective. Really, this topic in particular is one where just an ounce of prevention goes a long way. You're far better to look at these issues up front than to get hit with a lawsuit or receive a letter from the Department of Labor because they think you've misclassified somebody and now you owe potentially a whole lot of money and you've got to pay an attorney a lot of money to protect you. You're much better suited to again, look at these things up front. So
Well, yeah, I'm so glad we're talking. And when you and I chatted a few weeks ago, you started to tell me some things about why it's so important. I'm like, okay, we need to talk more about this because we know it's important. And we do tell our small business clients, really, find out, talk to an attorney, talk to somebody about what someone should be a W-2 or independent contractor. But after our conversation, I'm like, no, can you help? Can you shed some more light on that? And you're a small business owner, so that's even better. So you know what everyone's going through. So
right.
Yeah. So what does W-2 mean?
So in its simplest form, a W-2 is basically the form you get from your employer indicating the wages you received for the prior year. So I mean, right now it's in January, at least when we're recording this. So everybody's getting their W-2 or they just received it. So it's just another way, or it's a form from the IRS to basically indicate that, hey, you're an employee.
Right. And they're paying your employment taxes, things like that. So what's an independent contractor mean?
So an independent contractor is somebody who's not an employee. Typically, they're going to get a Form 1099. So the distinction and the difference is really, okay, you have an independent contractor, Form 1099, not an employee. A whole lot of things that an employer doesn't have to worry about when it's an independent contractor as compared to an employee.
Yeah. And why does it matter if someone's classified a W-2 employee or an independent contractor?
So there's a number of different reasons it matters. Most significantly, if somebody's an employee, then the employer owes them certain duties and obligations.
Okay.
You've got to, one, they're owed protections under the law. So like Title VII, race discrimination, age discrimination, disability discrimination, all those things, those are protections that employees have that independent contractors don't have generally, at least under those laws, right? Then there's tax requirements. If you're an employee, as an employer, you have certain taxes, Social Security, Medicare, things that you need to be taking out. There's also requirements for employees in the state of Ohio relative to unemployment taxes with the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, as well as, Bureau of Workers' Comp and things along those lines. If you misclassify somebody as an independent contractor when really they should have been an employee, the damages are potentially significant, especially if you do this with a whole class of workers. So maybe you have one particular physician or worker and you the first one you classify as an independent contractor, and then you hire 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 more of those, and you continue to classify them as an independent contractor, and then you later find out, oh shucks, these people should have been employees, or worse yet, the Department of Labor or the state of Ohio or the IRS figures out that these people should have been employees. The damages stack up really, really quickly. Everything from, again, the payroll taxes that you should have paid that you didn't pay, the benefits, depending on how many employees you have, if you're offering benefits, maybe under the Affordable Care Act, if you're, an employer with more than 50 full-time employees, you got to offer health insurance to 95% of your folks. There's the wage and hour issues. So if and this can be significant under the Fair Labor Standards Act is the federal law, and then you've got state similar wage and hour laws. But employees are owed overtime and minimum wage. Independent contractors are not. So say you've got an independent contractor that really should have been an employee and they were working 50 hours a week. You're paying them whatever you were agreeing to pay them as an independent contractor, but you weren't paying them any overtime. Well, guess what? If that independent contractor, so to speak, goes and talks to an attorney, and there are, from the time I started doing this to now, there are so many more attorneys that are doing these wage and hour cases that, they go to talk to that attorney, and that attorney realizes, oh, shucks, this person should be an employee. They're going to sue you. And the damages are going to be significant because you're going to have to pay them overtime, which is obviously a time and a half. Then there's going to be punitive damages, which is double anything, or liquidated damages, which is double anything that's owed to them. There's potential for attorney's fees. If the Department of Labor sinks its teeth into you, you're looking at fines and a whole slew of other things. And then one of the worst parts about it, especially as a small business starting out, there's potential owner liability separate and apart from the business, which is huge, because now you're not only putting your business at risk, you're also putting your personal assets at risk.
Yeah, there's so much to consider, and I feel like, especially when you're starting out, you have good intentions, and you really just think, oh, well, this person's helping me 20 hours a week or 25 hours a week, but you really need to figure out if they should be W-2'd or independent contractor. So how do you know if someone should be a W-2'd or independent contractor?
Right. So unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that.
Yeah, right.
There are more tests than I can count, probably, in terms of how you figure out whether or not somebody's an independent contractor or an employee. The IRS has its own test for tax purposes. The Department of Labor has a test for wage and hour purposes. Ohio Department of Job and Family Services has a test. The Bureau of Workers' Comp has a test. The courts have a test. So they're all over the place. But what I would say is there are some similarities between the tests, and there are factors that overlap in some of the tests. There's no one factor that controls in any of these tests. So really, it's a balancing of interests and a balancing of factors. In terms of some of the factors that you look at, some of the ones that are more important, one of the key ones is who controls the manner and means by which the employee or the worker, I shouldn't say employee, the individual performs the work, right? So if say you're a cleaning company and you've got an individual and you say, okay, we contract with this office building, you need to clean it, right? The more you tell that employee or that individual how to clean it, when they need to clean it, what cleaning supplies they need to use, the more that person becomes an employee and the less they're likely to be found an independent contractor. So that control is really a key and one of the most critical factors across the board for the most part. The hours that the individual works, also critical. If you're the business owner and you're dictating when the individual has to work or when they need to be there or not be there, that lends itself to an employee determination, or as compared to independent contractor, where the work's performed. If they're performing the work at your location,
I learned that a few years ago, and that was an eye-opener to me. I was like, really? Like, they can't come to your place of work? And I know we're going to get into that in a little bit and some other questions I have, but that was surprising to me when I learned about that. Yeah.
So it just depends, right? Like if you're a retail business and you're hiring somebody to work your register at your location, they're working there at your location. That person's going to be an employee. Now, if you're
Mhm.
hiring an IT service provider to come in and help you with some IT services, even
Sure,
though that's also at your location, that doesn't make that IT service provider an employee instead of an independent contractor, right?
sure. Right,
But
right.
depending on what they're doing and where they are, it's certainly a factor that needs to be considered. Whether or not they're performing the same work as your employees. So again, to
Mm,
use that retail example of somebody running the cash register, right?
mhm,
So you run
mhm.
a retail business, you've got a sales associate, and you've got 4 sales associates that work for you. And then you've got somebody that comes in a couple hours a week and they're doing the same thing as those sales associates. Just because they only work for you a couple hours a week doesn't mean they're now just an independent contractor. They're doing the same thing as your employees.
Right.
So another key factor is whose tools are they using? And when I say tools, I mean not just what you would historically or traditionally think of as tools like shovels, axes, those types of things. I'm talking your phone. Did you give them
Yeah.
a phone to use? Did you give them a computer to use? Did you give
Yes.
them a uniform or, a t-shirt that's got your logo on it?
Mhm.
Did you give them a company email address? I would kind of lump all those into tools. The more tools
Mhm.
that you're providing as the employer, the more likely that's going to be an employee and not an independent contractor.
Interesting. And we see that a lot with our home remodelers or our landscapers or something like that, where they, it can be seasonal construction or, especially landscaping, stuff like that. And they'll say, well, I'm just going to hire, just pay them, as a independent contractor. And then we'll say like, well, are they using your shovels? Are they using, right? Or are they bringing their own supplies? And then, trying to explain to them the difference. And then if they really are bringing all their own stuff, they need to invoice you and you pay them and things like that, right? Like, but it's
Yeah.
really, we run into this all the time with our, especially construction services, landscapers, stuff like that. We get that question a lot, but
Oh, for
it's
sure.
they can't use your tools and stuff.
Yeah.
Or
I mean,
drive your car, like drive the truck around. It's probably
if
not a good
they're
idea.
if they're driving, A to Z landscaping truck, right? And you're going to say they're an independent contractor and you're A to Z landscaping,
Mhm.
depending on what everything else looks like, that's a tough sell, right? Like that's
Yeah.
not an argument that I'd want to be on, the employer side of for the
Mhm.
most part, right? So
And
tools is a big one.
yeah, and I know it's because I think sometimes I'll save employment taxes if they're independent contractors, but really that's a small amount of money to pay versus what could happen
Right.
if you're doing it wrong, right? If you're classifying uh,
100%.
it wrong.
100%.
Yeah.
You're far better served to pay the taxes, the social security,
Right.
the Medicare, get them set up
Right.
as an employee. If it means you got to offer them benefits, they're going to be eligible for unemployment. All those things, right, are
Yeah.
in the big scheme of things a drop in the bucket compared to the potential liability, including the personal liability, if it's later found that they are actually an employee and not an independent contractor. And a lot of times what happens is, you'll have somebody that you've been treating as an independent contractor for call it 3 months, and then you decide, okay, I don't need that person anymore. Well, they go file for unemployment.
Right.
And then unemployment's like, well, wait a second. We don't see, this company is having you as an employee, or worse yet, the employer comes back and says, that's not one of my employees. And now Ohio Department of Jobs and Family Services is looking into it, and you're in a world of hurt because now they're not just looking at this person, they're looking at somebody else. And all these government entities and agencies, they have what's called information sharing agreements where they're telling each other, like, okay, we found this in unemployment, but you should probably be looking at this for workers' comp stuff too,
Mhm.
right? So now you got multiple problems.
That just
They,
makes my
they,
head spin. I'm like, oh no, right? Like,
yes,
yeah.
yes.
Yes, but
So,
yeah.
so
Mhm.
tools is a really big one. How
Yeah,
you
yeah.
pay them is a big one. And,
Oh,
and
yeah.
and
Yeah.
and just so we're clear, like there are instances when they can use your tools. You just got to frame everything appropriately, right? To your
Sure.
point. How
Sure.
you pay them is a big one. It's better to pay, by the job. I get very
Mhm.
nervous when a client's telling me that they want to pay an independent contractor by the hour. Not to say
Mhm.
it can't be done, but it just,
Mhm.
you start paying an independent contractor like an employee, it starts looking like an employee, right?
Mhm. Right,
Um,
right.
is the employer providing any training to the independent contractor or to the individual. The more training the employer provides, the more it looks like an employee, right?
Mm,
Because again, we're talking about control.
mhm, mhm.
Um,
What about a
does
contract with an independent contractor like that, you know?
So a contract is definitely a factor in a lot of the tests, and it can
Mhm.
definitely help, right? And
Okay.
I strongly encourage any small business that's going to regularly use independent contractors to have an independent contractor agreement, because it is a
Mhm.
factor that people will look at, or that the government agencies, the courts will consider when trying to make a determination as to whether or not somebody should have been an employee or an independent contractor. And
Mhm.
it also helps in a lot of ways the employer, the business, know these are the things I should and should not be doing with my independent contractor. Like, I
Right.
like to write the agreements in such a way that, well, one, that everybody can understand them, that that doesn't include a whole bunch of legalese, but that the employer or the business can use as kind of like a guidepost, because
Mhm.
that agreement's going to say certain things like, this is how this person gets paid, or this
Mhm.
is how we're going to address tools. The independent contractor is free to complete the work in any fashion that they see fit. They can complete the work at any time they see fit, so
Mhm.
that the employer can go back to these things, this agreement, and say, okay, I got to follow this, because if I don't follow this, I'm running the risk of creating an employment relationship, which I
Sure.
don't want.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
an agreement is definitely something that employers should be looking at and
Yeah.
considering.
And then what about insurance for independent contractors? I mean, and employee taxes and stuff like that. Like um, that's something they need to handle on their
Correct,
own,
correct. And
right?
a good employment, or excuse me, a good independent contractor agreement is going to even address some of those things too. And you
Right.
want to cover yourself as an employer, right? If you're
Yes.
hiring somebody as an independent contractor, and in the construction field in particular, right? If they're on
Mhm.
a job site of yours and they're doing something, and heaven forbid somebody gets hurt,
Right.
whether it be the independent contractor or maybe the independent contractor that does something that hurts one of your employees, there's certain indemnification provisions you want to have. There's certain things that you want to make sure your independent contractor has, including
Mhm.
that they're set up as a business, that their
Yeah.
employees are covered by, the Bureau of Workers' Comp. So you're not left,
That's
holding the
right.
bag, or they're not trying to come after you for things.
That's right. So
Um,
definitely calling your insurance agent and making sure you're covered for those extra that liability.
it certainly doesn't
Definitely.
hurt, right?
Yeah,
And it
right?
would be a
Yeah.
best practice for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. So, um, you paid, oh, my independent contractor paid that person $100, or, well, it's real, let's say 600. That's what I should really say. 601, $601. Should I provide that 1099 to them every year in January? Do they do it themselves? I think I know the answer, but do I have to provide that, or can they just put it on their, 1040?
So if you've paid somebody more than an independent contractor, more than $600 or more, you
Yeah.
should be issuing them a 1099.
Yeah. Okay.
In order to do that, typically you're going to get a form W-9 from the independent
Right.
contractor. It's got
Right.
their tax ID number, and then you or your accountant, your bookkeeper, can issue the 1099.
Yeah. Yeah. And then and this is just a reminder that if you are working with independent contractors, they need to invoice you for your books so that you can have a paper trail from you then paying them. So that's just my little reminder that you definitely need to, it can't just be like, oh, sure, yeah,
It's certainly
and a
helpful, and
handshake.
another reason why, even if they don't do the invoicing, if you've got an independent contractor agreement that talks about the pay, that helps too, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe you don't get that paper invoice, but you've got your independent contractor agreement, so you can at least have a paper trail of sorts.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So is there anything else that our small businesses should be doing to avoid potential issues between employee, W-2, independent contractor? Any other tidbits they should know before deciding? Or maybe if they're not sure right now, how can they protect themselves so they don't get those
Sure.
fines?
Yep. No, absolutely. There's a lot of things that, small businesses can do. And, I know and I appreciate that small businesses are very cognizant of, the money they spend, particularly on legal.
Mhm.
Fortunately, there are some really good resources out there from the Department of Labor as it relates to the Fair Labor Standards Act. The IRS even has a form, it's called the SS-8, that kind of is a form that the IRS will use to determine whether or not somebody should be an independent contractor or a employee. that a business can use. Like you can use that. Like if you're a business and you just want to kind of do a rudimentary review of whether or not somebody should be an employee or a independent contractor, grab that SS-8 and go through it. It's a 2-3 page form. Go through it. Maybe if you think you're going to do it the wrong way, or you have some concerns, or you don't feel real good after you've gone through it, call somebody, call an attorney. And if you're going to call an attorney, call a labor and employment attorney. Don't call, your brother-in-law or your sister-in-law who's a criminal defense attorney.
Right.
And I get those calls from people like, oh, I get this happen. And it's like, I don't do criminal law. So
Yeah,
same thing with labor and employment law, right? Like you want to talk to somebody that does this regularly. Um,
exactly.
you know, take the time though. I mean, you can find the factors and you can kind of go through them and just go through them
Mhm.
and kind of make your own conclusion. And again, if you're unsure about it, then, you got to talk to somebody else. Now, what I will say is that one of the best tests I've ever heard, and I can't take credit for it, my mentor at my old job, he's the one that, told me about it, is a very simple question. And that question is, what would the person say if you asked them where they work?
Right.
And if they
Right.
say, I own my own business, I work for, Joe's Framing, and they're on your construction job and they're framing in and you're not doing that as part of your construction job, great answer, right?
Right.
But if you ask that person, or if you ask that person and they'd say you, guess what? You're probably their employer. Like
Yeah.
that's the simplest like test to boil it all down into like one simple question. And it's never that easy. But it's a really good thing to just kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great place to end. So thank you so much for your assistance with this, and for being supportive of our small businesses and for all the help that you do provide. And we are again, we get this topic asked to us all the time. We cannot answer legal questions, and that's why we partner with amazing attorneys like yourself and have you as a resource for our small businesses. So I'm going to actually in the chat stick in that form SS8 in when I post this, and then I also post David's contact information so that if you're interested in talking with him further, you'll be able to reach out to him on your own. So David, thank you so much. And I look forward to chatting again.
Thank you, Beth. It was a pleasure. I appreciate you having me.